which I think will be the best day of the quarter for many reasons, but mainly because of our event today. I'm very happy to introduce Professor Naylor, who's the director of the Center of Food Security and the Environment at Stanford University. She's the William Wrigley Professor in Earth Sciences and a senior fellow at Stanford's Woods Institute, which is a bit like the Bren School there. She got her BA in Economics and Environmental Studies at the University of Colorado. She got a Master's of Science in Economics at the London School of Economics, and then a PhD in Applied Economics at Stanford University. Her research focuses on the economics and biophysical dimensions of food security and the environmental impacts of crops and animal production. She's involved in many field-based research projects as well as synthesis work. The outcome of her great energy and creativity is an amazing wealth of transformative papers in top-tier journals, including, of course, Science and Nature, concerning aquaculture, but also crop production, livestock systems, biofuels, climate change, food price volatility, and food policy analysis. And we're very lucky to have you come today, and thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, welcome everyone to the last day of class. My class is getting their final exam right now as I speak to you. So hopefully I can make you happier than I'm making them right now. So I gather my role is to talk about aquaculture as the final speaker of this series. So I know some of the material that has come before, and I'll touch on it, but I'll be fairly brief on those aspects. But I want to really focus on the solution side and on the science that we know, that we need to know to get to those solutions. And so I'm going to have a fairly broad swath of topics here. But before I get started, I wanted to thank my former graduate student, Dane Klinger, who was actually on a review paper I had on solutions in aquaculture. And some of this material I'll talk about today is in nitty-gritty detail in that review. It's still quite current in the annual review of environment and resources. And then Ling Chao, who is a postdoc that's working with me in China, and really both super scholars. So as you know, the reason why you're here is because the demand for fish has been growing. I mean, we have not only many more people on the planet, going from 3 to 7 billion people and going up towards 9 to 10 billion in the future, but each of those individuals is eating quite a bit more fish. From 1965, 9.5 kilograms per capita. Now all those additional capitas are eating at least twice as much each. And so as we move in this demand-based system, is it really reasonable to think that we can meet all those demands from the ocean and from freshwater systems in terms of wild capture, or are we going to really have to move to aquaculture? And as you know, because I'm the last speaker, that the global capture really has been constant. This starts in 1990, but we can go back before that. At about 90 million metric tons for the total global capture. And the food component of the global fish capture has been at about 60 million metric tons, but really stable. And the non-food is down here with reduction fisheries at about 20 million metric tons. The big changing feature, of course, in this slide is aquaculture. And it just continues to grow. And in fact, in 2011, the food that came from aquaculture really exceeded that came from wild fisheries for the first time. So 1 out of 2 fish you're getting on your plate is coming from a farm already. We were testing that at your faculty club today to see if they knew where their sustainable fish was actually coming from. So, and when I look, so I deal a lot with the world food economy. And in fact, the exam today is in the world food economy for those students. But when I look at the different components of the world food economy, aquaculture is growing by far the most rapidly. So this is why I'm very interested in this. During the past couple of decades, 1990 to 2010, it's been growing at 7.8% per annum in terms of volume. And that's just a huge, huge growth. And even relative to, we think of pork and poultry growing really rapidly, particularly in the developing world. It's about twice that. And of course, dairy, grains, beef, all down at about 1% per annum. And so how do we make sense of this growth? Is it sustainable? How do we make it more sustainable and find the solutions that work economically, biologically, and environmentally, as well as socially? Where it's occurring is mostly in Asia. So the red here is in China, again, 1990 to 2013. And in the green, other parts of Asia. That's over 90% of where it's occurring. So I do work a lot in Asia as a result of that. I know there's Latin American focus here. The U.S. is in purple here, and the rest of Latin America is in blue. So pretty small relative to the global picture, but nonetheless very important. And because China is so big, I call it the 800-pound gorilla that I need to know more about if I'm thinking about global aquaculture. And I was telling some of your colleagues and professors today that working in China has had its host of challenges, but we're still in there trying to make this work. And of course, if you look at the top 10 aquaculture producers by volume, China is at about 62%. That includes shell weight of shellfish. But U.S. less, 0.2%. So we're really, really small in this overall scheme still. And by value, about 45% still China. Most of this is in Asia. Chile and Norway are up here on salmon issues. But again, U.S. less than 1%. And so the U.S., we can talk more about the policy environment. We've had a lot of overlapping regulations. Makes it pretty difficult for farmers to expand. Catfish is our biggest enterprise in the Southeast, but obviously we're talking here about expanding ocean aquaculture. What is interesting to me about aquaculture and why it's so fun to work with is just how diverse it still is. When I work in agriculture, it's rice, wheat, and corn, soy. It's really come down to not that many major crops. And same with breeds of cattle or types of poultry and so forth. But here we're working with over 660 species that are farmed around the world. Freshwater is about almost 260, and marine is also at about 260. Marine has been increasing quite a bit in the past decade, and about 141 brackish. But, there's just such a range of systems and such a range of possibilities leading to all these dimensions I want to talk about on the solution side, from which ones need a lot of feed, like fish inputs in feed. Obviously, shellfish don't, but tuna really do, and this is shrimp in Thailand that also does. Which ones are likely to have big pollution impacts? Which ones use a lot of fresh water and land and so forth? And so each of these systems has its pros and cons, but we have a lot of diversity to work with here. And there's a lot of benefits of aquaculture and what we'd like to see more of in aquaculture as we're looking for solutions. What are we trying to augment here? We're trying to augment fish, obviously. Fish that are safe and affordable, that have food safety aspects, don't have hormones and antibiotics and all that stuff in them. We're trying to augment rural incomes and coastal incomes in the process for food security. And there's a whole number of ecosystem services that aquaculture can play a role, from wastewater treatment or even bioremediation of areas to creating habitat structure for wild fish and rebuilding wild fish populations, the sort of stock enhancement that comes along with that. And it actually can lead to more research on wild fisheries because you've got these captive fish. And so there's a lot of benefits, and I'm only probably not listing all of them, but there are also a lot of costs. And I want to make sure that what we're trying to reduce as we move forward is a whole number of things too. From the excessive use of freshwater, energy, and land. These are all scarce resources. We don't want the destruction of coastal habitats or pollution from uneaten food and species. Chemical waste. We don't want to eat a lot of antibiotics and hormone-laden fish supplies. We want to minimize disease and parasite transmission in wild fish and escapes and invasion into the wild. And then many of the ocean systems will have natural predators, and even the freshwater systems, and we don't want to do damage to just natural systems that see this as a great buffet of food for them to eat too, right? With some of the brackish and freshwater, we can get salinization of groundwaters. And of course, overfishing to meet the feed demands in aquaculture. And that's a balance that I've spent quite a bit of my own research focused on. And so the goal, as I look at the goals in meeting the economic, biophysical, social, is to augment the benefits and reduce the costs. And I'm thinking along several levels here. And so this is a fairly broad talk. As I go through it, I see it as technological approaches. How do we change the kind of culture systems that are out there and feed possibilities that are out there? And I have to say, in working in China, they're all about technological solutions, okay? That's really what they focus on in their 5-year plans. But there's so many management improvements also. For example, polyculture versus monoculture, different feed practices. And the policy environment really sets the stage with what's possible. What are the price signals that producers are receiving in this process? And it's governed a lot by policy, regulations, and so forth. I'm gonna end with just a very brief statement on the resilience. Does aquaculture actually add resilience to the overall food systems that we're looking at? And this is some work we've done recently, but it's kind of ripe for a lot more academic research, I think. So when we're looking at improvements in culture systems themselves, a couple of the goals here are, to reduce the amount of freshwater and land use. I mentioned that about 40% of what we're seeing in aquaculture is freshwater, and it does require a lot of water still in freshwater systems. So how do we think about either recycling water on land, intensifying production, or moving to the ocean? When is moving to the ocean a good thing? And we're also, on the technological side, trying to reduce nutrient and chemical pollution by treating, converting, diluting waste, or breeding species that have less waste themselves. And so there's a number of sort of guidelines here. And of course, intensification is the key. And I would say that all of my research, whether it's crop, livestock or aquaculture, has been on this intensification process. I mean, we've got so many resources on this planet, and moving towards 9 billion people, food systems are necessarily going to have to intensify. And what that means in aquaculture, an intensive pond, depending on which species, how long the grow out is, and so forth, I mean, all these species are quite different, can yield about 20 to 100 tons per hectare per year, depending on stocking density, artificial feed use, commercial feed use, aeration, and so forth. And extensive, just throwing fish in the pond, letting it grow without much inputs, will be 2 tons per hectare a year. So we're talking really about the ability to an order of magnitude, or 2 orders of magnitude, increasing the amount of fish we're getting out of a certain amount of area, okay? And can we do this in an environmentally sound way? That's what I'm all about. This is China's, one of their renditions of intensification. So we had this conversation at lunch, because I've been working in China a lot, and I keep saying, okay, we can see the individual systems and the benefits and so forth, but when you get to the scaling up of all this stuff, what does the scaling up actually look like? This is not what I have in mind for the kind of intensification we're moving towards. I mean, it's just so problematic in terms of the health of those ecosystems and even the fish that are in those kind of ecosystems. This was actually in a National Geographic article. I thought it was just a fascinating picture. But we are starting to do work in this Fujian province in Luoyang Bay. So I'm seeing a lot of this kind of sites. And we've done quite a bit of work because China's aquaculture is so massive in the global scale. And what we're seeing in our work in the past 6 years or so, we've done surveys in freshwater systems that are very low on the trophic chain, low valued, food security, carp, tilapia systems. And in these typical kind of systems that you're seeing, we went specifically to carp areas and tilapia areas. We're seeing, because of freshwater scarcity and land scarcity, farmers, in order to maximize the returns on those resources, they're putting a lot of high-valued species now into those ponds with the carp and sometimes with the tilapia, depending on the commercial scale. And so they're putting more different kinds of fish in there. They're throwing more feeds and other inputs in there because you have these high-valued fish, often really with inefficient feed targeting. And so now we're putting a lot of demands on the overall wild fish resources for aquaculture feed. I'll get to that by this polyculture, not quite scientifically targeted to maximize the feed inputs of each of those species, but certainly from a producer's point of view, it's still maximizing their economic return. Okay. So in carp and tilapia, we found 31 other kinds of species, and that's a practice. That's an intensification practice that we're starting to see, and it looks good on the surface, but again, you know, if aquaculture is going to add to fish supplies, it can't be depleting on the feed side. So fish meal, fish oil, and you had a lecture on that, and I'm gonna come back to that. So in carp, the inclusion is very small. You know, 1 to 5% of their feed is fish meal, for example. But there's so many carp out there. You know, the aggregate effect is so large that China still dominates the world market for this resource. So I wanted just to mention, and this is in the review paper, but I wanted to go through a couple of different ideas for a structure of systems to give you a sense of how we think through them. The first is just recirculating aquaculture systems on land, and here the idea really is to improve the water intensity, to reduce freshwater use. You know, if really we're going to try to produce more fish on the freshwater side, we can't use too much fresh water. You know, it's going to be limiting in some systems. So conventional aquaculture systems, how these work, and the details can be found in the paper, is from the fish you're going to filter out some of the solid, uneaten foods, feces, and other bacteria, and filter that out and put it into sludge, and then filter out some of the finer wastes, nitrogenous wastes and bacteria, and use the beneficial bacteria in both nitrification and denitrification to really reduce the ammonia and nitrites that are harmful to fish in these systems, and to some extent nitrates as well. And so what you're doing is trying to control the biogeochemistry of these systems in such a way that you can reuse the water back into the fish tank and go from 3,000 to 45,000 liters of water per kilogram of seafood down to 50 liters in the freshwater. And that even includes the use of water in feeds. Or in some of these marine recirculated systems, as low as 16 liters per kilograms of fish. So huge savings. And this technology works. You know, it's there, it's being experimented with, it's really cool. And you can locate this anywhere. You can locate it in the desert and use, you know, solar for an energy source, or where other foods aren't going to be competing, or you could locate it near urban areas where the markets are strong. But the scaling is really hard. You know, these are expensive systems. The economics doesn't quite work out yet, especially relative to alternative types of systems. And you can get the accumulation of pathogens and other contaminants in this system. And once you get that, it's really hard to get rid of them. And so waste removal and pathogen control is difficult. So these are experimental, but still we need some models out there that we're focusing on that, you know, that have possibilities. And China, for example, said they're going to move a lot to this system. And I'm thinking, really? You know, the scale and the cost of these things is going to be a little bit difficult. Similarly, aquaponics now puts another level of a product in there, right? And so this gets talked about a lot too. Same thing, you're taking the solids out, and rather than taking all the nitrogen or nitrogenous and nutrients out of the system, you're using it as a base. Instead of soil, you're using water to grow different plants, lettuce, herbs, you know, spinach, and different plants that aren't too nutrient intensive, that can grow in this system that has some of the nutrients left after the bad bacteria and bad wastes have been removed. And so this is really, a lot of people are talking about this, and we see a lot of experimental sites up in even northern, you know, the San Francisco area right now. You can get about 7 kilograms of vegetables for every kilogram of fish. So, you know, if we're going to feed these larger urban populations, this is an opportunity to start combining these integrated systems in interesting ways. And you're getting a lot of good recirculating water. at about 320 liters per kilogram, because you're using some of it in the plant. So higher than the recirculating, the RAS, but still really, really good. And they're growing a variety of things. Tilapia and lettuce would be the big one that you're seeing a lot of. But you can do, perch and barramundi and other things as well as other vegetables. But the challenge is, how do you get optimal growing conditions for both the plants and the fish in this combined system, and scale it again? What kind of land requirements, how big do these things actually need to be? What are the energy costs? And I think consumers aren't quite ready to eat the lettuce and stuff out of material that is used, from feces and other waste from fish. The food safety, that side still has to go, and the certification, organic's not certified organic because of that. So again, some of the institutional economics can be pretty tough. And then moving into the ocean now, this IMTA, the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, I think is gaining a lot of traction, where you would have your finfish species, and down current you would have a shellfish species that would be able to absorb a lot of the particulate matter, and seaweeds that could absorb a lot of the nutrients, right? And then you would also have shellfish and seaweeds coming out, and sometimes these seaweeds, there's a abalone grower here in the audience. Okay, you might even be doing some of this already for your abalone. And I know in Chile they have pretty effective systems as well. And so, in these systems, the shellfish can remove over half of the particulate matter, and seaweeds absorbing about 60% of the dissolved inorganic nitrogen and phosphorus. And so, these are great designs as well for intensifying and getting multiple products. And China and other parts of Asia are starting to look into this too. But the problem, there are some challenges with this, and part of it is disease risk. When you're putting a lot of these species in close confinement next to each other, often bacteria will bioaccumulate in ways that will create red tides and other things that can be really problematic. And some of it is not knowing how getting in the right current structure and fast enough currents and everything. But the size of the infrastructure sometimes can be very, very large, and we're starting to do work on just when is infrastructure for these things too big in terms of its impact on the marine ecosystem process. And of course, the economics, again, is difficult for this in terms of food safety. Do people want to eat these shellfish that are coming from waste of these fish? Consumer acceptance cost are issues here. So it's working great in some areas, but the commercialization and the scale is still fairly limited. So the last sort of structural one I want to raise is something that a lot of people are working on here in Santa Barbara, is offshore aquaculture. Let's just take it further offshore, and where fish can swim in large cages or pens. And actually, we're not using land, we're not using fresh water, with potential to really reduce the pollution from these systems, as well as coastal habitat destruction. And these fish now are growing much better and are healthier. They're just swimming against a big, massive current out there somewhere, right? And so this now simplifies everything else I've been talking about. The challenges still of this are, offshore has a lot of different definitions. How far offshore? Federal waters, state waters. Within state waters, who owns the water? How do you lease relative to transportation, Navy, recreation, all sorts of other things. And so I know you're doing some spatial analysis on this, which is great. Predators can be a problem here, because predators do see these systems as a great source of protein themselves, and they get into these systems sometimes in very destructive ways. And so, then the response is, let's kill the predators, but that gets into now a whole nother set of environmental and ecosystem issues. And they tend to be very capital intensive, a lot of very high production costs in terms of labor, energy, feeds, because you often, if they're offshore but near shore, really, you can grow low-valued species. But the really far offshore ones, offshore, are, it's it's tough to have the capital equipment to withstand storms and take the transportation and everything. So you're going to get into very high-valued species that typically use a lot of feeds. So, you know, what about the scale? Is dilution a solution? What about escapes, pathogens, and so forth? Is that all just taken care of by the ecosystem itself? And here we are doing some work. This is just the predator issue. This is in some tuna cages, yellowfin tuna cages in Mexico, where, you know, a lot of sharks are moving right into these systems. Big sharks, you know, they're killing the sharks. And so that becomes an issue. Dane Klinger has worked with me on trying to, you know, what does an offshore system for yellowfin and bluefin really look like? And he visited the systems in Croatia. Just looked like beautiful systems, really rapid current coming down this coast here. And so, you know, so it's offshore, but in this case, not that far offshore. So, you know, that was more easy to deal with. These other cages, these submersible ones that can go up and down in the water column and so forth, are probably more expensive to manage. And one of the questions, I think this might have even been taken from hubs or someplace near Santa Barbara, because often they're located near decommissioned oil rigs or near wind power systems now, so for the infrastructure aspect. And when we go and look at one at a time, they look, you know, they look pretty good. And I'm always thinking as an economist, you know, what happens, though, to make the economics of this whole supply chain work? What, you know, it's going to start to be scaled up. You know, what happens when it starts looking like our current livestock systems? And then what are the implications? So in our modeling exercises, I think it's important to look at one at a time, but also the scale up of where the economics is going to be taking us with these systems. We're doing work, I'm personally doing work with a group in our civil and environmental engineering groups, say, okay, do we have this sort of feedlot of the sea situation here where just all this nutrients and so forth go out into the ocean and we're okay with that, or is it really diluting? And we've modeled the waste flows using Suntan's program that was developed in our engineering department. And I can show you the slides. The acronym is really long, and I would mess it up if I tried to say it. But it's a two-dimensional model that is taking account currents and depth and bathymetry and so forth. And modeling, for example, if you have some pens along a coastal system and you've got circulation with a bay and tidal flows and river inputs and so forth, measuring what's happening with the waste over time as these fish ponds or these fish cages are developing in terms of scale and time. We're now doing some three-dimensional modeling with this on a new grant that I'll mention. But you can't see this from the back, but the model would essentially take a farm here where you have feed coming into the farm and fish going out of the farm. You have feces and particulate organic waste coming down. And it's coming down into a benthic system here, but it's also being washed by turbulent flow, either from, you know, currents and so forth, and river flow. And some of the waste coming out is going into soluble nitrogenous wastes, you know, that are picked up by part of the food chain within that system, the phytoplankton and zooplankton, which recycle this stuff. So it's taking account all of this, and then you can model the density variability, you know, the different complexity of the bathymetry of the topography, the earth rotations. Presumably we're going to rotate the same way, but you can actually play around with that to see how big a difference it makes, the winds, riverine discharges, and so forth. And it's been really interesting because within these cages you can get both the nitrogen and phosphorus waste coming out of that. The nitrogen, about 20 to 30% actually taken up by the fish, and here 15 to 30% of the phosphorus. And the rest is being lost into these different pathways, dissolved into the water, into the particulates that go into the sediments and so forth. And this, all can be modeled with actual parameters that we can see. And so what we're finding here, for example, in intensive salmon-like pens, is a discharge after 6 tidal cycles. It doesn't go in a Gaussian fashion just everywhere, right? It adheres and actually adheres and just goes right down the coast in a pretty cohesive manner. So I think and this is after 60 tidal cycles, and so I think the surprise and what you can do with these models in terms of sighting and understanding the impact is that we can't assume dilution is a solution in a Gaussian sense. There tends to be very high concentrations that will go over periods of time, and that's really going to be important in understanding the solution aspect of this. And there's intermittency both in time and space, a lot of variability that can be sort of picked up from these kinds of models. So this is a tool then, that can be used in sort of understanding solutions as we move out into the ocean, which I think is very interesting. And we're starting to use this model in a three-dimensional sense. Now, not all fish are obviously fed, and one of China's real goals is to say, let's just go lower on the trophic system. This is oysters, though. I mean, it's a really intensive oyster system. You've got seaweeds and mussels in these different systems. And so the scale of this infrastructure does change the flow, the sediment transfer, and so forth. And so we're using now three-dimensional models to start understanding how that would affect recruitment of fish and phytoplankton and so forth. And so these tools, I think, can be really cool in understanding what's the right scale if this is going to be a solution as opposed to just a partial solution. So I want to talk just a moment about feeds. I know you had a great talk on feeds last week. And this is taken from a tuna operation where tuna, unlike a lot of the other fish that are farmed, tends to be ranched still, and it's using just anchovies and sardines right out of the ocean. So, sort of 20 pounds of anchovies to 1 pound of farmed bluefin. Yellowfin's better than this. But huge amount of fish resources. Most of the feeding issues that we see are more pelleted feeds coming also from anchovies, sardines, and the other forage fish. So when I think about this, and I've written tons about feeds, so I couldn't have a lecture without saying something about feeds. But when I think about it, there's so many other alternatives to just mining fish out of the ocean for feeds. And this is where the industry is really working hard because feeds are the highest variable cost in the budget for fish that aren't filter feeders. They can use whole fish like tuna or fish meal, fish oil inclusion. And almost all these different operations are now reducing the amount of fish meal and fish oil that they're using, right? And they're doing so by putting other things. Plant-based feed material, proteins, energy, out of plants, soy, for example. Rendered animal products, feather meal, bone meal, that kind of stuff for protein. There's really cool single-cell organism ideas that I think you heard about last time. And then there's the whole idea, which I think is interesting, if we're growing so much more fish in farms, just using that material and recirculating the waste in ways that can be the fish inputs in feeds. And then we have other bycatch and so forth that's often used. And so there's a lot of alternatives that feed companies and aquaculture producers can work with. But there's other alternatives. There's breeding species to be more efficient at their feed inputs. We've done this in livestock and tons of work in this area. And also the selection of species that would be lower on the trophic chain. So all of these different options, and we had a PNAS article that just kind of went through a huge review of these things with different people working in aquaculture for a long time, really determines, what are you going to see in terms of profitability at the end. It's nice to say, let's all grow carp, but is that going to be economically profitable, and does anyone want to eat it over on this side of the ocean, So there's economic value that needs to be taken account of, fish health and growth, can fish grow as well on some of these, and what is the health of those fish. So it's a complicated industry, obviously. What feed and feed strategy also determines the pollution of a system. If it's all grain-based, fish can't really absorb that, and there's going to be a lot more feces coming out of a grain-based diet. Okay. And also in terms of fish health and human health, if the fish are now eating soybeans and corn and stuff, we're not getting the omega-3 great, we're eating kind of a hamburger. We're not eating a salmon that is the long-chain omega-3. Okay, so these are trade-offs that we have to recognize in this whole system, and it does come down to how we're depleting the wild fish populations to actually get aquaculture to expand. So there's a number of really interesting resource issues here. as an economist, I like to think, okay, you've got everything from dry distiller grains, feather meal, soy meal, poultry meal, meat and bone meal, corn gluten. Then you have the anchovy meal. We're used to that. You know, what is the cost of these different things? When you look at the protein that you get out of it, the cost, this is dollars per metric ton. You know, dry distiller grains are pretty cheap right now. Feather meal is, so just taking all those feathers off of all those chickens is a much better way to get the protein. But consumers are like, really? I'm not sure, you know, I really want a salmon fed on feather meal. You know? So these are all these kind of things, whereas anchovy meals right now, quite expensive. You know, the fish meal demand's been growing about 6 to 8% per year, and it's not just aquaculture, it's our fish oil tablets. A lot of things are taking up the fish meal, fish oil right now. So this is quite expensive relative to all these other alternatives. But when you go into an aquaculture operation, a big aquaculture firm, you know, they're going to be sitting here. I wasn't allowed to take a real detailed picture, but he's got a big linear programming spreadsheet, and he's looking at how the costs are varying and knows the fish health interactions and everything at any given point in time. So there's a lot of alternatives that they're weighing in terms of profitability in these large operations. This is actually from a tilapia operation. So, so fish meal, you know, what I worry about is aquaculture sounds great, but if we're going to be just capturing all the anchovies, sardines, herring, and so forth that are on the bottom of the food chain to feed to farm fish, then we're going to be disrupting the food chain in ways that won't be okay over time. We're going to have this farm fish. And so we can talk more about, I'm really simplifying that argument right now, but one of my students, Chris Fetter, did a fish map and just looked at who are the big importers and exporters of fish meal. And the net importers in the dark red is China's the big one here, importing about 1.2 million metric tons out of a market of about 5 to 6 million metric tons. And of course, Peru is a big exporter. Chile, U.S. exports some as a third. So you know, it tends to be dominated. So one of the issues people say, don't wild fish also eat these fish lower on the trophic chain, which of course they do. But if you're catching a lot of anchovies here and you're shipping them all over here, you know, there's a certain ecosystem effect that is going to occur at a certain scale again. So, so we've been looking at China, and this could be generalized to Asia systems as a whole. And Asia, again, is about 90% of aquaculture, so I think it's worth looking at. Their fisheries tend not to be just single species fisheries like we have in this country. There are single species fisheries, but there's also these multi-species fisheries. Boats just go out during the time they're allowed to go out, and they just catch everything. And they put it on a dock, and they start sorting it out. This would be food, this would be feed, this would be fertilizer, and so forth. And so we're finding in the China case, a lot of the aquaculture, especially the higher valued aquaculture, is utilizing this. Now you could say it's bycatch, but it's also just scooping everything out of the ocean. There's no bycatch really. It's just taking it all and putting it into these uses. And when we sort through it, so these are pictures of it. You know, every fish meal plant you go to kind of looks like this. But when you sort through some of this, what we're finding is that 32 to 50% of any given fish meal plant that we're going to has important juvenile species and small pelagic fish and crustaceans and so forth in there. A total of about 56 trash species have been identified that are in use for aquaculture. So we don't really know, you know, we don't really know what the impact of all of this is. Some of them are overexploited, and the stock status for most of these fish still remains unknown. So as the aquaculture sector is increasing and using more feed, you know, this is some of the repercussions, and you probably talked about this a bit last week. We did a model that's from a science paper earlier this year, so I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but if China already 75% of its fish supplies come from aquaculture, and it also processes a lot of fish for re-export and so forth. If you use the processing waste and you reconverted it into feeds, and we talk about, you know, how much do they consume out of whole fish versus processed fish, how much is exported and so forth. But starting with the global imports and the domestic aquaculture and fisheries, how much is whole fish processed? what we find is that you can get out of this about 1.3 million metric tons of fish meal and about 0.31 million metric tons of fish oil out of the existing material right now. And just to remind you, China currently imports about 1.2 million metric tons of fish meal. So there's ways of thinking about recycling materials, keeping in mind food safety and so forth, that I think are promising. The Chinese say, I'm not sure this is really true because we eat whole fish here. But actually, they do process a lot for re-export. And as they modernize and urbanize, they're eating more processed fish themselves. And so this is even with fairly conservative estimates. And so it's just another possibility for a solution that I think is a neat thing to think about. And it doesn't have to be, we were working in China. It can be right here at home, too. There are nutritional limitations, there's issues that you have to deal with here, but gives you the broad sense of how much material is there. Now, of course, the last thing is just breeding to have fish grow a lot faster. That's another intensification process. And many of you probably know that we're sort of in the process of approving a GMO salmon from Aqua Bounty right now in the United States. And growth hormones have been used in fish prior, but this particular one is the first one that's really being approved for commercial sales. So this is taking a growth hormone from a Chinook salmon, and then it has an antifreeze protein from promoter from an ocean pout that makes that growth hormone work, essentially. And it reaches the market size in half the time. So you can get, like, when we look at what happened in crop agriculture, the Green Revolution, now we're producing 3 crops a year where we used to produce 1. We were reducing the maturity and growing more crops per area per year in regions that we can do that. That's what this is all about. So has not been approved. It's still being considered. It goes back and forth, but you can keep your eye on it. This is at the same time of the growth stage, same number of months into the growth stage. This is the GM fish versus the Atlantic salmon that is the regular guy. So we can get a lot more fish if we're willing to go this route. I'm not like a huge fan of this, by the way, but I'm sure many of you guys might be fans here of the GM fish. And the last option, this was an issue I know you guys talked about last time. This is using methanotrophs to actually create fish feed out of methane that comes from an energy source, from natural gas. And Calysta is a group that's up in the Silicon Valley, right down the street from me, and they came and talked to me after our science paper came out and said, we really need to talk to you about this really cool technology. And I think it really is very cool that you can make a fish feed out of an energy waste. So fracking is growing very rapidly, and you're burning off the methane. You're taking the methane, and I can't even begin to describe how I've visited their plant, but how you're actually getting the methanotropes out of this. But the methanotropes then can be converted into the protein source that go into actually the pelleted feed that are being used. And so there's a lot of, so you're getting the methane with another biochemical process, basically, to get the protein and carbohydrates and fatty acids. And then there's a lot of other chemicals and so forth and industrial products that come out of this. And when we met with these guys, they said, as most startups, this actually was bought by a Norwegian company, so it's probably similar to what you heard about last week, right? They bought it in 2014. But a lot of the profitability comes from a lot of the side materials, actually, that they don't even know what they are yet. So that's kind of the cool thing, and I think Hunter, we're going to do life cycle analysis on. They want us to come up and do that whole life cycle analysis on this. But when you see, it's called feed kind protein, and the percent of protein relative to fish meal, 70% protein that you're getting out of this versus 60 to 72% in fish meal, so it's doing well. The percent fat is 10%, which you want in salmon, versus 6 to 10% in fish meal. And then you're getting fiber, less than 1%, less than 1%. You don't want a lot of fiber because that's what the waste is. And then the shelf life's over a year, and the shelf life of fish meal is only 2 to 6 months. So there's a lot of benefits. Now, if they're really successful, they will produce 8,000 metric tons. And remember, we're talking about 5 million metric tons, out there as the big number. But still, I think this is kind of some of the directions that are really cool that we're heading in the future. So, so the use of wild fish for feed with all these different ideas could be reduced, and science can help us get there, I think. The economics still really counts. You know, will we farm everything at lower trophic levels? Does everyone want to eat at that level, or is the demand really at these higher levels? I think we're still going to have big demand at the higher level. Should aquaculture be regulating its feed use, or should we really be sourcing from sustainably managed fisheries, regulate at the fishery level? And my hunch is that we should be regulating at the fishery level, and these need to be compatible. So I want to end with just a couple of statements on policy, because I focus a lot on policy. And if the policy, the signals that producers are getting from the policy environment are not the right signals for innovation, they're probably not going to innovate just because they're so altruistic, right? I mean, a lot of people do, and we're seeing a lot of this forward-looking thinking, but you want the policy, you know, the incentives to be aligned with objectives. That's just my basic message on policy, is to align incentives and objectives. So innovation really requires a clear set of policies, and we don't really have that in the US policy circles at this point. There's a lot of competing regulations, and it's not really clear what's going to work for people investing a lot of money in this. And you know, right now, some of the critical resources like freshwater are just not priced right, you know, and so there isn't an incentive necessarily to save it in an sort of an agriculture food production setting. Non-point source pollutions, not always costed. If it was a cost, that would provide the incentive to reduce the pollution coming out of these systems. You know, how this offshore public resource issue, the Coastal Commission, I think we were talking about, still doesn't want even good, you know, it's a debate on who owns those resources. But it needs, you know, I've worked a lot on the California policies, as well as tried to put in suggestions at the federal level just to guide what environmentalists would approve and aquaculture could live with and so forth. It's complicated, but I think we also need to spend an equal amount of time on the policy side, including making the regulation of wild fisheries compatible with all this. So looking out to the future, you know, is aquaculture going to make food production systems more resilient? Or is it just adding to our food system problem that we're just using more and more resources in these various ways? And this was a question a number of us asked out of the Stockholm Resilience Center. Will aquaculture make our food systems more resilient in the face of climate change, variability, and market fluctuations? And we used kind of portfolio theory to do this. And the main point here is the diversity really counts in aquaculture, and I'll just summarize by saying, when we looked at market price variability of crops, livestock, and fisheries over time, fisheries and aquaculture were the least variable in terms of price, and crops have been going all over the place, with more of them used in energy inputs, you know, biofuels, as well as a lot of policies on this. And so I think the richness of diversity and the substitution possibilities on the feed side and on the product side makes this still fairly stable as an industry. This is correlations that don't matter, but I think what matters is the coefficient of variation for aquaculture is lower than it is for food, meat, you know, different fish or livestock and capture fisheries. Aquaculture tends to be the most stable, and so as long as the diversity of the systems and the ability to substitute feeds and so forth, it can add resilience. And so what we don't want to have, I think, is a pattern where the aquaculture sector just follows what we've done with livestock of let's narrow down to 3 species and, you know, and use really intensive feeds and so forth. What we want, I think, is to promote a fairly rich and diverse system. So with that, I will just end and take questions. Thank you. And do you guys want to join me up here at this stage, or how do you want to do it? Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question. It seems to me that the single aquaculture system is very little diversified. So like if you grow tilapia also, it seems to me, I think it's loud enough.
Yeah.
Well, they're trying to pick it up on the recording, so it's not to project it.
Okay. And it also seems to me that it's a quite risky enterprise. So you have the germs or so these problems that maybe the whole system breaks down. And I wonder how diversification of a single aquaculture system affects the risk. And I was surprised that you said in one point that these systems that use like different trophic levels are more risky because you can have like more pathogens spreading across species. So I was wondering what the impact of diversification of a single system is on risk, and what the barriers to like diversification are if systems are so little diversified.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And of course, you know, China has been farming fish for centuries and centuries, right? And they've been doing it in these polycultures where they, you know, the waste from one fish is picked up as feed to the next fish and so forth. That, I mean, that goes way, way back in terms of what they've always been doing. And it's still possible to do that in systems that you know and understand. The IMTA, those systems, I think that's really interesting too. And I think it's a matter of experimentation and understanding bacteria transfer and where it's likely to accumulate and blow up in the systems. So, you know, that's one of experimentation. China and many other systems now that are trying to do polyculture within ponds and so forth are just still, you know, experimenting with this stuff. I think there's a lot of room to gain in terms of understanding the compatibility of feed and waste transfers among species and disease control. Disease issues are a big problem. You know, it's not just understanding getting the best growth rate of fish and so forth, but disease transfers really are a big deal in aquaculture. And it's probably one of the things I worry about most about just putting fish out into the sea, because, you know, there's been a lot of pathogen and disease transfers to wild fish and so forth. And with warming of the oceans, you know, that's actually probably going to become more problematic. In fact, the fish will probably grow faster because they're going to eat and have better appetites and so forth, but the disease pressure is probably going to get worse. So the risks are pretty high, you know, and that's why, you know, this is a different deal than having crop agriculture. I mean, you still do have risks of disease and pest pathogens and all that kind of stuff. But in this milieu where you have water flowing in and out and you can't necessarily control it, and especially in the oceans, I think it's quite risky. And so, you know, so being in an area that really does flush out, if you have a single, you know, species or a set of species, and you really do have very fast currents. The Croatia one was one, they just had a massive current going down that coastline with a single species. You know, that's probably, they're figuring that that's working pretty well. So, you know, how we think about risk then again needs the right sort of, I think, policy environment to reward people for going that route. I also do work at the very low end, say in Kenya, on, you know, using aquaculture. The Ministry of Fisheries trying to really promote aquaculture as a rural development goal there. And it's been picked up by entrepreneurs kind of at the middle income level, but the poorest of the poor, it's like, I don't know how to raise a fish, you know, I don't know if it's alive or dead in this pond, and, you know, do I want to really put all my money into that? And they'll put a lot more money into raising a chicken that's walking around their house, but they know how to raise that chicken, and they know where to sell the chicken and everything else. And so for them, the risk, forget it, you know, but for others that may have alternative backup incomes and other sources or insurance or whatever can do it. So, I mean, it's, you know, the diversification, really there's so much breeding effort in a couple of Atlantic salmon. There's so much breeding for all these disease and pathogens. That's why we are getting more of that. And that's why we always have in our food systems come down to a few species and crops and species of livestock that we know, because all the research has gone into doing that. So we're probably destined a little bit, but, you know, maybe there's whole new sets of ways to deal with these issues that would be different going forward. So It's exactly the right question, and I think it's challenging. But we still see 660 species, and that number has gone up a lot. It's not going down. So that's at least pretty promising. People are playing with a lot of different things.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really fantastic. I'm really interested in the work you're doing in China specifically, just because, like you said, it's the big gorilla in the room. It's really controlling so much of global aquaculture right now. And as you discussed, from your perspective, and I think most people's perspective, their intensification isn't necessarily the way the rest of the world should go for aquaculture. And so I kind of had a two-part question. One is, from your experience, what do you think China sees as the future for aquaculture? Is it similar to your vision of the future for aquaculture? And secondly, how do you think approaching a sustainable aquaculture system is different in somewhere like China that has a very developed system versus somewhere like the US that doesn't?
Yeah. So what's written into their 5-year plan is eco-intensification of aquaculture, okay? And so they're doing it with large systems that are low in trophic level, so mussels and seaweeds and stuff like that. But they also are thinking of these big offshore cages of high-valued species that will be out there in the ocean somewhere. But really, they say, when we talk to the people that are contributing to the 5-year plan, they will say, we have farmed the land. We've had a landscape that might be grasslands or whatever, and we've just farmed it. So why not just farm the whole bay? Like, why wouldn't you want to do that? So I mean, they really don't get why you wouldn't just do that. And so it's really different. Intensification sort of, it can be using more inputs for more outputs in a really confined space, or just intensifying that space in a way that I was showing that's maybe not really good intensification practices. So they're trying a couple of these different things. They talk about recirculating systems on land, but I think that's just not going to be, I don't think they have the land and the resources necessarily that's going to be the big game changer. Several of the people that I've been working with over there see a lot of efficiency gains that could occur in the freshwater systems that already exist. And the problem is the water coming in now is more polluted than it used to be. And so it's an accumulation of heavy metals, and also, so they're at a point in their development stage, they almost have to go way offshore. And their other strategy, of course, where's Hunter? What's their other strategy on sea cucumbers? Go to French Polynesia and just farm them there. Right, and go outside. And yeah. So it's interesting. The Premier has now taken up, the president has really taken up air pollution because he knows people can't breathe. But maybe ocean pollution's not too far behind in terms of or water pollution, freshwater pollution, in terms of food safety, because they're huge fish consumers there. So I don't know, I think the food safety and that aspect is maybe the right avenue to get them to think about pollution at the same time. So.
Question, you started out prompting the talk with the change in per capita protein need or intake. And so a lot of the growth is to meet that demand. It seems to me, my own diet, too much protein is not healthy. And so the links to human health, we tend to think of them as feeding people who need protein, but a lot of it looks like just a production of a product that may be actually unhealthy for us because we eat too much protein. Is there work on this issue of how healthy this kind of intake is, and might that be? It seems like part of it should be saying we don't need as much as we think we might.
Well, it is a huge issue, and so when you look at Asia and all their farms, all these different places, a lot of that is eaten by less wealthy households, right? Who probably, actually, a number of them probably do need more protein or do need more micronutrients and so forth. But a lot of it, we say all of aquaculture is for food security. That's just total BS, right? I mean, it's like shrimp for us, and there's value in this industry, right? And a lot of it is for the value. There's no question about it. So it's a really complicated issue. I mean, I think there's a lot of people in the world do need more protein, right? But they're not necessarily the ones that can afford this. So in the Kenya case, it's probably a really good goal to try to get tilapia farms in these areas that have water and so forth. They're adjusting to this. but in a lot of cases where we're producing more and more fish and we're exporting like all the Chinese tilapia to us right now, eventually they're going to eat more of their tilapia. And more of that's using soy. You know, it's like eating a hamburger pretty much, you know, but it's maybe not intensely as fat accumulated. And so, you know, I think we're, you know, it's a rapidly growing industry, but I think that we're wrong to say we're doing this just to, because we need to feed the world. I think what's happening is responding to a demand that people would go out and buy it, you know, and there's value in then growing it, so. How to, yeah. Well, our policy, of course, U.S. is a big net fish importer. And so our policy is to say, let's reduce net fish imports by having more fish produced in the U.S. So we're going the opposite direction. And a lot of it is shrimp and stuff that's probably not as healthy for you as some of the other, like, well, yeah. It's really complicated. It's a great question, but very complicated.
So you talked a little bit about using feather and bone meal,
Yeah.
As like feed for these aquaculture systems. And I read a paper recently talking about how antibiotics tend to accumulate in those areas of the animal, and then they're fed to these fish. So have you found that to be a problem, and especially with like food safety and these antibiotics being transferred to those fish without really meaning to?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't found it to be a problem, but I think you're exactly right. The accumulation of hormones and antibiotics and other things in especially the rendered animal product chain is, I'm sure, not a great thing. You know, so we have been looking over a whole policy on antibiotic use in this country on animal production, but not every country is doing that. I mean, it's widely used around the world. And when you go to a feed manufacturer that's doing big feed, like Cargill or something, I mean, they're finding it much cheaper, and then they can say, okay, we're reducing the amount of fish meal and feed, so we're not actually depleting the ocean. So it sort of looks good, but then there's this other aspect to it. So so I don't know of specific research that's looking at that, but I think it's definitely the trade-off that we're going to get. So now you get to ask all of these guys.